part of the reason I really wanted to do this as writers is because I believe as writers, it is our mission to understand and have empathy for others so that we might bring the stories of other people into the world.
So that we're able to kind of center our understanding on that lived experience. And so for me, what's really important about writing in any way is finding a way to really just capture the stories and the lived experience in a way that really honors people.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to a special episode of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is episode 172, and it's coming to you between episodes 171 and 173. Now, normally the podcasts are released late Thursday Eastern Time, early Friday, but this is a special episode that's going out on Tuesday, and this is a recorded conversation from sort of a mini virtual conference that Jeff Elkins, the dialogue doctor, put together. Now, it's a discussion led by Paz Galupo and Carin Galupo on understanding sexual and gender identity, and they work in a lot of academic areas, academia, to help folks understand the very complex nuances. It's not as simple as sex and gender. As you'll see, there's multiple complex layers of identity, and it was amazing to look at some of the resources that they share, from my own personal experience, because I learned a lot as a person, and I learned a lot as a writer. And this was a phenomenal conversation, and I really wanted to share it with you Reflectives, because I thought it was important. And so I am going to forego the normal introductory matter where I do personal update and comments, etc., etc. I am going to do an ad read from this episode's sponsor, but I wanted to get right into the conversation because you have over 2 hours of this amazing conversation. Now, the conversation is Paz Galupo and Carin Galupo, as previously mentioned. You have Jeff Elkins and Laura Humm. You may recognize the voices from the Dialogue Doctor podcast. Then you have JP Rindfleisch and Chris Cain, who are co-hosts of the Right Away podcast. This is a sort of a gathering of podcast minds. And we're all in conversation, obviously led by Paz and Carin, and it's fascinating. And without further ado, I'm going to do the ad read, and then we'll jump right into this conversation. This episode is sponsored by Findaway Voices. Findaway Voices offers authors an opportunity to get their work out into one of the largest distribution networks of retailers and libraries in existence. Not only can you use them for finding a professional narrator if you're looking for one, but you can use them for distribution. You have a choice. It's not all or none. It's very selective. They allow you to find your voice with the audiobook space. One of the benefits of Findaway Voices is they allow you the opportunity to control your prices at about 98% of the retail library platforms. And they're partnered with Chirp, owned by BookBub, for amazing opportunities for promotions. Promotions, I said that right. I'm not going to edit it out. You can also get promotions as well as those promotions. Promotions sounds like something fun you might chew on. If you're a long-time listener, do you remember when Findaway Voices used to sponsor tongue twisters? And Will, who is the head of Findaway Voices, used to send me these tongue twisters and get me to read them in the ad spot. And I thought it was kind of cute because I always tripped on my tongue and sometimes had to bleep out words and stuff like that. Well, apparently Will does not have to send me tongue twisters. I will twist my own tongue just trying to say regular words like promotions. But you can get promotions. You can get promotions through Apple Audio. You can get promotions through Chirp. Findaway is always on the cutting edge, always doing something innovative and exciting for authors. And if you're looking for ways that you can leverage Findaway Voices as an author, you can go check them out over at starkreflections.ca/Findaway.
So let's get going. Thanks, guys. I'm super excited that we're all here and that we get to do this. I've from like episode 2 that I started the podcast, I was like, this is something we have to do. So, and I'm really pumped about it. So what I want to do is, this is the first ever kind of mini conference that I'm putting on, and I want to make sure everybody gets an opportunity to introduce themselves. One, so that those listening to this will know everybody's voice, and two, so that so that we can all just know who's here. If you can't see it, I'm sorry. I'm just gonna babble because I'm super excited. Okay, so I'm Jeff. I'm the dialogue doctor, and I write supernatural thrillers, and my pronouns are he, him. Laura, why don't you give us a quick introduction to who you are?
So I'm Laura Humm. I use she, her pronouns. Jeff allows me to provide he finds helpful. Not really sure why. So I'm super pumped to be here.
Awesome. JP, you're the next in my little roundabout chart.
I'm JP Rindfleisch. I'm co-host on the Right Away podcast. And I use he, him pronouns for now. But yeah, that's me.
Fantastic. JP, what do you write?
Right now, working on urban fantasy series.
Awesome. All right, Chris.
I'm always so slow on the unmute button. I'm Chris Cain, co-host of the Right Away podcast. I write all over the place, but under a super secret pen name. I write romance, and that's what lets me be awesome full time. And I use she, her pronouns.
Awesome. Mark?
Mark Leslie Lefebvre. I mostly write under Mark Leslie for obvious reasons. I go by he, him. I'll go by they, them as well. I write urban fantasy, horror, paranormal, speculative fiction in general.
Awesome. All right, let me introduce our two guests that are giving us time today. And Paz and Carin, again, thank you. So Carin and I have been friends now for 4 or 5 years. Carin was coaching basketball, and I watched them coach basketball and decided that they were an awesome person that I needed to have in my life. So they graced me with their friendship, and I have learned so much by being their friend. It's really been somewhat of a life for this ex-Southern Baptist, ex-evangelical pastor. It's been somewhat of a massive milestone step on my journey. So I will ever be grateful, and I'm excited that I get to share Carin and their partner with the world a little bit. Their partner is Paz Galupo. Paz is a professor of psychology at Towson University. Oh, I should also say, Carin's a phenomenal writer that works with Laura and I at Submersion. Sorry, I'm so excited about our friendship. I forget all of your accolades. Carin is a fantastic writer that works with Laura and I at Submersion. So Paz is a professor of psychology at Towson who specializes in sexual orientation and gender diversity. Are you still the editor for the Journal of Bisexuality?
Yep.
Okay. And I'm sure there's more accolades that you have that I am not listing. So I'm super excited for y'all to come and just talk to us about, to take us on a little bit of a journey about understanding gender identity, to open our eyes and help us see through the lens of others a little bit. And part of the reason I really wanted to do this as writers is because I believe as writers, it is our mission to understand and have empathy for others so that we might bring the stories of other people into the world. So with that brief introduction, Paz and Carin, I'm going to let y'all take it away.
Okay. I'm going to make you figure out how to make sure that. I'll also say that I'm really excited to have this conversation with people who are writers. And even though I don't write fiction much, really what I do write scientific articles specifically about gender. And my research really focuses on trying to collect really their stories and the ways in which they experience the world, and trying to do right by them by taking their stories, trying to understand them, put it in scientific terminology so that most of psychology and most of the medical science who don't think about trans and non-binary and queer identities in general, so that we're able to kind of center our understanding on that lived experience. And so for me, what's really important about writing in any way is finding a way to really just capture the stories and the lived experience in a way that really honors people. So it's really exciting in some ways because it feels like I do a very different type of writing, but I think it's the same. I think the point is to communicate, to kind of live in that experience, to be able to perspective take and to humanize, right? And to humanize experience in one way or another. And so I'm just kind of in awe of what you do as writers. And I'm hoping that this is a framework. We tend to do these trainings in some ways. Often we're asked to come in and talk about gender and sexual orientation in a way that helps people understand the community. But one of the things that I really try to emphasize is the fact that by thinking about gender diversity and thinking about the framework that we're going to kind of show in terms of thinking about gender mapping, it really is a way for us all to think about our own gender, regardless of where kind of you position yourself. Everybody has a gender. Everybody has an experience. And part of being able to tap into, I think, anybody else's experience is also to know your experience well. And so I'm hoping that when we go through this, not only will you think about it as, oh, how could I maybe write about queer characters or trans characters, but like also really use it as a way to think about how we can diversify it and make salient, I think, the complexity of everybody in one way or another.
Yeah, and I think for us, Jeff, if you could share the screen, or so I could share the PowerPoint. I think I don't have privileges to do that.
Yeah,
but
so sorry.
while we're doing that, I just wanted to add
I'm keeping all of my privileges to myself.
Is the one thing that when we talk about gender is that it's such an individual experience, but we live in a society, so we don't get to always we have to negotiate that in relationships and in relation to others, and that often can change and add different dimensions. We're often asking individuals, we look at it as a responsibility or a luxury maybe that some don't have to interrogate their gender, but in actuality, there's a richness and there's an empowerment in spending that time and having that conversation and being intentional about it. And so I feel like when I'm writing, there's a pressure to tell a story. And I have to remember that that if I'm intentional about that story, it adds more clarity to like, why do I need this character in the world? And I think that sometimes we do it because we think that we need to honor the diversity in the world and we want to represent the diversity. And sometimes people, when writing, I'm sure do it because it might open up to a whole new set of people who might read or purchase your things. And so, so if we're intentional about that character or the intention that we're writing it doesn't muddle it necessarily where all of a sudden it gets into a one-dimensional piece. So I think the conversation today will help frame some of that in how to add some richness and variety.
But we did want to, and I think you are already speaking to some of this, but what the model that we're going to show, we normally talk about as kind of mapping gender. And one of the things that it really emphasizes is that gender is multidimensional. It's complex and it's experienced in a social context. And one of the reasons I almost always, when I do this, even when I'm in class, I always try to borrow Carin and have Carin come to class with me, because when we're talking about it, even my own experience of gender is something that I experience really differently when I experience it in the context of my family, when people read me differently if I'm by myself versus when we're together, versus when we're with our kids, versus all of those pieces. And so I think one of the things about gender is it's so absolutely personal, and it's a personal identity, but it's socially communicated and it's socially interpreted. And so my experience of gender also really shifts depending on the conversation I'm having. The language I use about gender is going to depend upon the degree of safety that we feel, the degree of understanding. And so we might have these very personal identities and labels that really work for ourselves, but might not be understood or communicated socially. And so one of the things that always happens when you have queer identities or non-normative identities in general is that you often have to code switch, right? You often have to shift how you're presenting yourself, making yourself palatable, making yourself feel more safe. And so your language is something that really shifts. Or it might not always be about safety, it just might be about what's understood. So we'll talk through kind of our identities, but at times I might label my sexual orientation bisexual. And that's a term that's probably more understood. If I were labeling it myself, I might say queer, or I might say pansexual, but I might choose to use bisexual depending on who I'm talking about, because I might not want to talk for 20 minutes and explain what pansexual means, right? And so the language, we kind of constantly have to shift and adapt our language in a particular way. And that happens a lot in the queer community. A lot of times people are like, there's so many labels, and why can't you all just use the same words? And why can't you all? And it's really because having a non-normative identity, the onus becomes on us to have to find a way to communicate to other people in a way that they understand, that the way that it's going to be palatable to them in that particular situation. And so it's not that we don't know ourselves, right? It's that we're so misunderstood in society that we have to constantly code switch in order to communicate for other people's comfort often. And so that's that social kind of piece to it that I think matters. What were you going to say, Jeff?
So if I can jump in real quick, just
Sure.
because I know that there are people out there that are like me, that like the idea of gender being beyond male and female is like speaking French to them. So I just want to I think what you said is really important and profound. So I want to just kind of rephrase it for a second and then ask you to explain a little bit of it. Ask you to explain some of it a little bit more. So to summarize what I heard you saying, gender is a very personal thing, that you internally know who you are in gender, or at least are on a journey of discovery for who you are as your gender. But then gender is also something that's interpreted by people outside of you that are looking in, and has this social context, so that the expression of your gender also has this play in the world around you and how people treat you. And you were using the word code switch. Would you mind going into just a little bit more about what you mean about code switching?
Yeah, it just means that the way that I have to express or think about my identities, I really have to think about that. I have to think about how I'm presenting myself, or the words that I'm using, or the ways in which I'm being read in terms of my gender, sexuality, or even race. So being a non-Black person of color for me is something that, I have to decide when I want that to be more salient in a conversation versus not. And sometimes I have control of that, and sometimes I don't. So I will say that often I have to I'm more often in a situation than Carin, where I have to come out to other people about my sexual orientation, because it might not be something that is as readily read about me. So our experience as queer people are actually really different, because when people encounter Carin, they're more likely to read them as queer. So it's not something that Carin necessarily has the ability to shift but I can decide to come out or not, and sometimes as a protective way, or because it's salient or it's not salient. So sometimes maybe it's important for my queerness to kind of be part of what is being negotiated in that immediate moment, and sometimes it's not. When you have a normative identity, often, and often you have to do that. Often you have to code switch like that when you have non-normative identities, when you're likely to be discriminated against because of them, or thought about differently, or devalued because of them. But when you have mostly normative identities, you kind of just show up in the world and you expect that people are going to respond to you in a particular way. And that's a privilege that when you have, so white people don't tend to come into conversations and think about, oh, how is my whiteness being read right now, right? But people make it very clear to me. I know when somebody reads me as somebody who's a person of color or thinks that that's salient, or when, I often get because I'm ambiguous racially to some people, that for a lot of white people, I'm kind of palatable enough, right? And so in that way, they kind of let that slide, and they don't make me being a person of color kind of something that's salient in that situation. I can call attention to it. I can out myself in terms of a lot of my identities, because I have a lot of ambiguous kind of identities, or borderland kinds of identities, where they're not necessarily known to other people. So for example, the fact that I'm not very often read as being Jewish. I'm like the most unsuspecting Filipino Jew there is, right? Like I don't fit that stereotype. So what that means though, is sometimes that people my Jewishness, right, isn't out there, which means I hear a lot of like anti-Semitic shit. I hear kind of what that is, and I can decide to put that out there. And if I do out myself as being Jewish, then I also notice how differently people kind of respond to me. And so code switching is this idea that you can make salient in some ways. And I make it sound like it's a strategy. It is a safety strategy, but it's also a burden to have to constantly think about how you're bringing your identities in and out of conversations, because what happens is most people assume normative identities. Most people are going to assume you're straight, assume you're kind of white, assume that you are cisgender, and only if they find a cue that feels out of place to them are they going to, maybe you look whatever people think, a trans or a non-binary person should look like, or maybe you look queer somehow, and then that becomes salient in a particular way. But you're kind of normative unless proven otherwise.
Yeah, I appreciate you explaining that. I know as a white Christian male straight who grew up in the South, code switching is never something I've ever had to even consider, right? Like, yeah, JP, you had dropped something in the chat. I'd love for you to share if you're willing.
Yeah. So I'm a white guy, which is pretty obvious, but I'm from the Midwest. I'm also a queer man, and I work in like the manufacturing world outside of writing. Often I have to use they pronouns for my partner, just because out of safety, especially in the Midwest when gay marriage was a stronger conversation. I constantly would use the they pronouns just to kind of identify who my partner was, because I just didn't feel comfortable ever saying he to a lot of people I worked with. So it took a long time for me to start saying he, him, and kind of acknowledging that. But yeah.
Can I ask a question that's sort of related to that?
Yes.
I'm curious about non-normative and normative, and I haven't really used or heard those terms much. So I appreciate getting those, because it actually brings a different context that kind of makes a higher level hierarchy, because it can apply to so many different variances. As the middle-aged privileged white guy, right? Straight middle-aged white guy. So I have all of these, I guess, perks or pros that come by default. But my partner Liz and I constantly try to use ambiguous ways to talk about one another. And even after we're married, we're probably going to continue to use the term partner, because I think, and maybe I'm wrong, if I use it more often, if in social contexts I identify the pronouns that I identify with, even if they're normative, that actually makes it less non-normative for people who are backed into a corner or don't have the luxury of the choice. Does that actually help?
It does, actually. I mean, I think it creates it takes away that assumption, right? So if you're being ambiguous, and even like APA, so I'm a psychologist, so the American Psychological Society now, or Association now, says use they them, use it as a singular pronoun. You can use it because you're honoring that that's somebody's pronoun, but you can also use it to refer to people when gender just isn't salient, right? And when you do that, and when you don't gender everything, there's so much about our language that's gendered, right? But if in situations you're not gendering it, then you're not making these heteronormative or cisnormative kinds of assumptions that are out there that then force people to have to insert the ways in which they're non-normative. Then it's just kind of understood that, you know what, everybody, people might have partners and they might not always have to identify their gender. So if you do that, then it doesn't seem so odd when somebody is code switching and being like, oh, my partner and they are this. It doesn't feel like you're necessarily hiding something, because we're all not showing up being gendered all of the time.
And I think code switching also has a way to retain power, but it also, for the individual, but it also creates distance. So there's only so much that someone is authentically willing to bring to the table. Like at JP, in the example you're giving, right? Mm-hmm. There's only so many people that are going to be able to be entered into your personal life, because we're not making space. And we're asking someone with a non-normative identity to come in with their elbows out and make space for themselves. And that's not always easy or comfortable. And so then we're not inviting people in. So by doing that, you're saying, here's the space, take it if you want it, rather than saying, create your own space in an environment where you're not really sure, how to do that, or if it's worth it, or if it's safe, or whatever those things are. So I think there's that idea of the language in code switching and why it happens. It's not always the same reason, but we're also missing, the richness of people, because we're asking them to shelf a part of themselves.
And just to clarify what you said about Carin, I think what you said just there is so important that I want to stay on it for a second. When you're code switching, what I hear you saying is that you're making a choice between, do I reveal who I really am and share myself with the world, and risk being discriminated against, risk being treated differently, in that idea of like, risk losing power in a relationship was how you phrased it, or do I retain power in the relationship, which is what I wanted to dwell on, because I don't think, for normative people like me, we don't think in terms of power because we always have it. So we don't think about the idea that somebody might discriminate against us based on us being different, because, we are the majority. So there's this idea of what you have to consider that, personally, I've never had to consider, which is the definition of privilege, is that you have to consider whether or not you're going to give someone the power to discriminate against you as you reveal who you are. Am I summarizing that?
Yeah, and to really know the implications of it, right? So if I say it in this one context, how do I know it's not going to come up in at work or in these other environments that could lose, or in a setting where I could be evicted from where I live? We don't have all the protections all the time in every single situation, in every single job, or every single housing. So, I think when you do that, you're not just taking the risk and saying what will I get out of this? You're saying what's the risk ratio reward for me? And often that you're taking that risk of saying, I will accept some social isolation to secure housing, employment, and things like that. And I think that we don't always talk about that because we're in a world in which we feel like it's getting better, right? And so in certain contexts, sure, there it is, and there are things that are progressing, and there are and it's conversations like this, and it's breaking down the idea that there's some, I think in any community or culture, I'm always, I know Paz shared earlier that we're Jewish, and so I grew up hearing a lot of Yiddish. And so I say things, at times people look at me like, nobody knows what you're talking about right here. But to me, I think it's common knowledge. I think that there are words that that I can't figure out a way to capture it in English. Sometimes it's like just a sentiment that and everyone's like, I'm kind of in context trying to understand what you mean. So I think we also know that language itself within community and across communities needs to evolve and be shared. So there is a mutual understanding, an operational definition, if you will, of what the words that we are saying, and what does it mean to within community or to somebody who identifies, and how is someone else perceiving that word? Because we also create a culture where there are people who do not care, but the people who do care so much that it also stops communication because they don't want to offend, because they don't want to hurt. And so then it leaves this little bubble where you have to figure out a way to cross that and have conversations so we can all learn from each other.
Yeah, I think the one thing too, the flip side to thinking about the discrimination and the safety, which is always an issue, but I think the other thing that I also want to think about, the flip side is, yes, you might decide not to bring your full self because of safety issues, but the other piece to it is think about what happens when you can bring your full self, right? Think about how much that space has changed. How much, like for me, it feels like relief when I can talk about all of my identities, or for when I'm not thinking about that. And I'm showing up in that space very, very differently than if I'm sitting there cognitively spending my time trying to assess my safety. And so, yeah, we want to make it so that people feel safe, but we also think about like, how much would our space be changed if we all just brought ourselves and our complexity there? And I think that this happens with cis straight people as well, as when we start thinking about gender, we have such strict ways of thinking about what's appropriate, that these ways of in some ways policing our own gender is something that cisgender people do too. It's something that straight people do too, because there is and often cis straight people do this in a way because it kind of stick to gender roles, because if they don't, then they're perceived as being non-normative, then they're perceived as being gay, or they're perceived as being non-binary or gender non-conforming in one way or another. And so that fear of that, regardless of your identity, is something that keeps us in these really strict and narrow places where none of us are really bringing our full selves to it. And so that gender binary, which is kind of the basis of what we're thinking of what we'll kind of talk about, I think is something that's really important. What I love about this conversation is I kind of had on this third point, this idea of positionality. And I think our conversation brought us there, right? Like this idea of what are all of our different social identities? How do we position ourselves? Do we know ourselves and all of our different aspects? And how can we kind of locate our gender in that way? For me, for everybody, I think that gender is something that is racialized as well. I think I'm more aware of it being a person of color, but I think that even that our ideas about gender are intricately tied to our ideas of whiteness as well. And so in order to fully understand gender, you also have to kind of fully contextualize that and understand how you're positioned in terms of your race, and in terms of your other social locations like sexuality and social economic status and all of those things. So even as we're talking about gender, it gets positioned, I think, in some of those other ways.
Pause before you go
Sure.
on for a second there. I love what you're saying about positionality, and I know you're going to get back to this, but right before you started talking about positionality, you said something that I think is really important, and I know you're going to highlight it later. But for those who are listening who maybe it kind of slipped by, you mentioned that oftentimes people with normative identities police their own gender because they're afraid that if they move outside of the very binary gender, that they're going to be seen as something they're not. But what I noticed that you said was that you didn't say that they would be seen differently as like male or female or masculine, but that they would be seen as gay or queer. And I think it's really important. And again, I know that you're going to touch on this, but just kind of as a preview, as we're like thinking about positionality, as we're thinking about how we negotiate our own genders, just this idea that we need to make sure that we're not conflating or making all of these things one. And you said it at the very beginning when you started, that gender is really multidimensional. And I think what you just said was so easily slips under the radar, because we do have this idea that someone who has a male sex assigned at birth, who tends to act more effeminate, is automatically assumed to also be gay. And I think that one of the things that all of the training and all the times that I've worked with you and with Carin, like that was the big thing for me, that was just like, wait, these things are discrete. We need to stop applying one to the other. So I know you're going to get to it, but just because you had said it and I feel like it kind of ties in with that positionality as well. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah, no, I love that you brought that up. And I'll come back to that too. I think when we talk a little bit about alignment normativity and our assumption that if you know where you're positioned on one aspect of gender and sex, that then we know what we think should be happening, or where our assumptions go for one of the other dimensions. But I think, yeah, absolutely, sexuality and that gender is something that's very discrete, and that's something that we'll kind of see on this map as well. We might have, I think, maybe go, no. There you go. So here's the difference. So we talked about gender as being something that is multidimensional. And so what we have on here is kind of a gender, a map, or a way of like pulling out different aspects of thinking about gender. This is intentionally written in a way that you kind of see the binary that's there, because that's our cultural assumption. We think of gender in very binary ways. We think of, if you're looking at this side, we're seeing kind of what we expect for male experience. On this side, we see what we would expect for kind of experience of women, right? And what we tend to think about when we think about any of these dimensions is that our cultural conceptualization is that gender is binary, which means that there are two possibilities that are the natural possibilities, that are the ones that are that we're going to assume when we think of something as being binary, and those are kind of the normative experiences. The normative experiences are the ones that also go unexplored, right? We don't have to explain. We don't ask people who are cisgender, why do you identify as a man? Tell me how you got that way, right? We don't devise entire psychological theories to try to describe why that happens, right? But it's the middle points, right? When we see human variation, which is very natural, that doesn't fall along these binary kinds of expectations, that's where we center trying to explain. And people whose experiences, and I would also argue that everybody's experience at times are going to fall kind of in that middle ground, but that's when you're asked to explain yourself. That's when your gender becomes policed in a particular way. And that can happen for, again, anybody, regardless of kind of where they fall.
Pause.
But
If I can jump in for 1 second,
sure.
for those listening who can't see what we're looking at, I'm
Yep.
just going to give a quick description. So what Pause has and Carin have presented is there are 7 spectrums on the screen. And Pause, I know you're going to walk through them one at a time, but just to give a quick overview, they're assigned sex, gender identity, gender expression and presentation, gender role, sexual orientation, attraction, and legal sex. And on one side, pauses on the left-hand side, pauses placed male, man, or masculine identities, and on the right side, pauses placed female or women identities. So sorry, just wanted to give a brief verbal overview of what we're looking at.
Yeah, I really actually appreciate that. I wasn't thinking about the fact that not everybody would necessarily be able to see it. But yeah, and that even in these different kinds of dimensions, so if we think about assigned sex, we think of having 2 possibilities, male and female. So there's kind of where that binary is. And we assume that those are natural. And we assume that everybody's going to have an experience that necessarily falls within that.
And there's an assumption that they're opposites, right? So that there one can't have the other. And I think the other thing that you can't see is that it's on a line, right? Because
on a continuum.
It's on a continuum, right? And so we're looking at this idea that if we're looking at male, that's enough. It's male, right? But what we're actually seeing is that there is a lot, right? There's a whole line of this idea of maleness. And so when we start talking about that, and you can see it at each level, if it's assigned sex, you can talk about whether it's based on external genitalia or chromosomes, right? If it's gender identity, it's based on, right? So we actually have a much wider and more full idea, rather than just thinking that it's male and female and they're opposite, and they're just sitting at the both ends in this very, very small, they actually take up much more space and have a lot more diversity to them.
Yeah, and I think what happens is when we think about the term gender, we might all come up with one label that kind of describes where we think that we sit. Or if somebody asks us our gender, we might just provide one label. But really, there's a lot of concepts that really fall under that kind of wider umbrella of gender. And so what we're seeing on the screen is all of the different things that kind of contribute to cultural conceptualizations of gender. So assigned sex is one piece, gender identity is one piece, gender expression is one piece of that. And each of those can be conceptualized really on their own kind of binary. And so as we're thinking about this, and as we're kind of maybe thinking about writing characters who have complex experiences of gender, it's helpful to not just think about where do they sit, what's their one label of gender. It's helpful to think about like where do they fit on this map kind of in general, and what's that kind of constellation look like. And so if we take the first aspect, that assigned gender, so here are the different dimensions again: sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, gender role, sexual orientation, sexual attraction, and legal sex. We have this concept, and I think this is part of what Laura was starting to kind of bring into hold, is that we have this idea that we expect all aspects of gender to align in a particular way. So we expect that if we know one person's experience and their sex assigned at birth, we expect then that we know something about their gender identity, their expression, and we expect all of these things to align. And we talk about that as alignment normativity. And a lot of the discrimination that happens for people in the queer community and even people outside that queer community, the discrimination happens when people's experiences of gender don't line up across these different dimensions. And it's this alignment normativity then that becomes the basis for cis normativity and for sexism and for heterosexism as well. So when we're thinking about assigned sex, and I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly, but when we think about assigned sex, sex in and of itself is what people think of as being biological sex. We try not to say biological sex. We talk about it as assigned sex because we recognize that there are a lot of different things that go into whether somebody is assigned male or female at birth. There's a number of biological indicators so we might think of somebody's a biological indicator as being chromosomal, as being hormonal, thinking about reproductive organs. And all of those experiences might contribute to appearance of genitalia. And normally assigned sex is something that is done on the basis of genitalia, right? Baby comes out, you look to see where their genitals are, and then they're kind of declared or assigned being male or female, or the presence of that even in utero now that they have, ultrasounds and other things like that. Some of our other indicators of sex, we might not even have access to information about. So we might not even know. I don't know. I've never seen a chromosomal printout of kind of where I sit in terms of my chromosomes, right? But I'm assuming that based on what I was assigned in terms of sex. And so that example kind of illustrates the fact that often we assume different things about people's gender based on things that we can see, not that we all go around with our genitals hanging out either, right? But we all assume what that is based on assigned sex, based on all of these other things. And so it's important, and it's actually really an interesting thing to think about when you're writing, because we visually ID people based on different biological aspects of sex, secondary sex characteristics, those types of things. But when you're writing a character, you might need to draw something visually, like an image visually, but you're going to have to do that in words and thinking about what information are you giving and providing. And when you're doing that, you're giving pieces of information that are going to play on people's assumptions of larger understandings of who that character is in terms of their gender. So that becomes also really important. And so there are a number of people who have a mosaic pattern among their different biological indicators of sex. And so we can talk about people who are intersex in a particular way. There's a lot of words that have been used historically about this. In a lot of literature, people talk about hermaphrodites. That's not seen as a term that we use now, right? That's seen as a more offensive term now. So that's a term that you might avoid. In psychology, we use the term now what's seen as disorders of sex development. People with intersex conditions. Most people in the intersex community don't prefer those terms because, again, they're very pathologizing and identify as intersex. But even intersex individuals, because we have such a strong binary system, tend to be assigned male or female as well. But that, again, just kind of speaks to the variation, even though we think about gender in these binary ways, and we still have our language that forces people into these binary categories. That's really not the lived experience of most people or of everybody.
Can I clarify just for a second? So when you use the term intersex individuals, that could potentially apply to a person who has physical evidence of both genitalia, male, female, or identifies with something that may not be what the assigned sex at birth was. Or is that right?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because often people who are intersex, a lot of times it is based on the presence of either ambiguous genitalia at birth, but there are a number of people who are assigned at birth. Nobody necessarily knows what that there's no understanding of a intersex kind of condition until maybe somebody hits puberty, right? And then with puberty, with hormones, sometimes maybe somebody doesn't menstruate, something isn't happening in a typical or expected fashion, and then they figure out, hey, maybe that person doesn't have a uterus, maybe that person, and that might not be something that about, like, you don't necessarily have a scan of all of your organs right away until something happens, right? And so there are a lot of people who are in their 20s or in their teens who something is happening that then they find something out. They find that out about themselves. There's also a piece of how intersex conditions have been treated in the medical community, where often parents might know that about their kids, but doctors have said, keep that information. Don't share that information with your child. And that's been the way the medical community has kind of treated that. What they'll tend to say is, we'll choose a gender, you're going to raise that kid as that gender, and never tell them about their intersex condition. There's a whole history to why that's the situation, but it also makes that very difficult because a lot of intersex individuals find out about those conditions maybe as teens or in their 20s, and then they find out that their parents have been withholding that information because that has been what doctors have suggested. And so then it feels, like your entire life and your entire family and support system thinks that you're wrong, right? That there's something wrong with your body, and also feels like it's a very shameful thing. And then often having procedures without knowing why they're having procedures. But again, that treatment in the medical condition and the medical community has partially been done in a way to kind of normalize genitals. A lot of the surgeries are to normalize the genitals because, again, our idea of what's appropriate in a binary way is really just so strong. So that's one example. So other than assigned sex, which we tend to strongly either have male or female, despite the fact that that's not really the biological reality in terms of diversity, we also have the other dimension, which is gender identity. And if we think of that in binary ways, we think of that as identifying as a man or as a woman. And again, we think of that as a very kind of naturalized experience. But really, there's a lot of different gender identities. Gender identity is the private experience of how you identify in terms of gender. And so there's a lot of different labels that people might use. Facebook, I think there's 51 different options of gender identities that people might use. So I have some up here on the screen, I guess, for people who are just listening, I'll read some of them. So they might be agender or bigender or cisgender or trans or genderqueer or gender variant or MTF. Those are all labels that are often used to describe somebody's private experience or their relationship to this construct of gender in one way or another.
So pause just to jump into that a little bit more, because I know when I first heard this, right, like assigned sex was like biological sex was, yeah, of course, that's what I know growing up, right? Like you were born a boy or a girl. So and I can remember my father, who was a gynecologist. I remember the first time he came home and was talking about delivering a baby, and I was like, well, was it a boy or a girl? And he's like, well, it's not always so black and white. And I was like, what? But moving into gender identity, if you wouldn't mind, for people who are brand new to this concept, because they have had a normative experience where their gender identity matches their assigned sex. Talk to me a little bit more. You're talking about kind of like when you look in the mirror, what you see. Is that a good description of it? Or what would be a better way to define gender identity?
Yeah, it's really not necessarily about appearance. So looking in the mirror might be more about gender expression, but gender identity is really your private experience. It's like, how do you relate to that category? And so the textbook definitions, although I think it should be widened, is how somebody identifies with either being male, female, both, or neither, right? So this idea that you might identify in one way or another. Now, again, alignment normativity tells us that we expect that somebody who was assigned male is going to identify as a man, and somebody who is assigned female is going to identify as a woman. So there's kind of two pieces to this. When we think of transgender, right? When we think of transgender, the term, or cisgender, the term, those are terms that have to do with the relationship between assigned sex and gender identity. So somebody who is trans is somebody who identifies with a gender that is different from what society would expect them to identify with based on their assigned sex. So trans is somebody who identifies, their gender identity is different from sociocultural expectations based on assigned sex. Somebody who's cisgender is somebody who is going to identify with a gender identity that's coincident with, that is expected from assigned sex. So it might be somebody who was assigned female and identifies as a woman, right? That would be somebody who is cisgender, or somebody who identifies as or was assigned male and identifies as male. So trans as a community, or as a umbrella term, kind of encompasses anybody who identifies with a gender identity that's different from what society would expect based on their assigned sex. So it could be somebody who is assigned male who now identifies as a woman, right? That's kind of maybe a more binary or classic kind of experience of what we think of when we think of somebody who is trans, right? We also have a number of people who are or communities that are non-binary, where people are using genderqueer or non-binary or agender as terms that are their private experience of their gender identity, but those are not the labels that that society would expect based on assigned sex. Does that make sense? So trans people often have multiple labels for their identities, because they might identify as male or female and use a more binary kind of term, or they might also use some other terms, and often they use multiple terms. So a lot of participants in my studies will talk about having I identify as a trans man, and I'm also non-binary, right? So because one label doesn't really capture that nuance and the ways in which their gender identity just kind of doesn't match what alignment normativity or what society would necessarily expect.
Can I ask just clarification on the term cis? I mean, when you say heteronormative, I know what heter is short for. Is cis short for something, or what is that?
Yeah, in Latin, it kind of means same side. So you see it a lot like in biology, right? It's same side, and trans means it's kind of moved over to the other side. So yeah, and so it's interesting because cisgender, we've had the term transgender for a while. Cisgender is something that hasn't even been used really in the even the psychological literature as long, but it was important to name in a way, because it's showing that there is that normative experience, and without having that term, it becomes really hard to explore it. And so cisgender becomes in some ways like the complement to the term transgender. And you can have cisgender people who identify as a woman, and you can also have transgender people who identify as a woman. So it kind of puts that terminology at that same level of kind of hierarchy, transgender and cisgender. And then you can have multiple labels that people would think of in terms of.
And I love that it normalizes the use of gender. So it's not just normal gender, right?
Yes.
It actually has cis. So it's, I really like that, because it's a very subtle thing, but it's powerful.
It is. And it's interesting because you brought that up too before, like hearing normative. And I really love that you paralleled that with normal, right? And I I normally try to clarify that, because normal is like, oh, what we think of as maybe being natural, right? But normative is saying, oh no, that's our assumptions that may be right or may be wrong, right? And it kind of it notes that power differential in some ways, but also the false power differential that we put on it kind of in that hierarchy of language.
And normative changes by culture too.
Yes.
So
yeah, absolutely.
Follow-up question.
Sure.
So as we're talking about the definition of gender identity, we're using words like someone's personal experience and how someone identifies. For those of us who have never questioned our identity as it relates to our assignment, can you talk a little bit about how this idea of choice comes into gender identity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting because we think of whenever somebody has a non-normative identity, we think, oh, well, you chose it, and you are kind of bucking the system, and whereas anybody who's kind of, I like to say, and I think you've probably heard me say this before, Laura, too, is that when I think about gender, the people who are the most unconscious about gender are cisgender people. Right? Because you haven't had to think about it in the same way. The people who are the most unconscious about sexual orientation are heterosexual people, and the people who are the most unconscious about race are white people, right? And that probably stings if you have that normative identity, right? But you haven't had to defend it, and you haven't had to explore it, and you haven't had to develop an origin story around it, right? And when you have a non-normative identity, you're constantly being asked, well, how did you know? And I don't know, maybe you just knew, right? And maybe most cis people just know their identities, and most straight people just know their identities, but they're not asked to explain it. But if you were asked daily to explain it, you would probably quickly come up with a little anecdote to explain to other people, like, this is how I know, right? And a way of kind of coming up with that. And so for me, it feels to people who have normative identities like you're choosing it because you have these words and you're stating it and you have this origin story, and it's like, and then I knew, but really you only have that story because you've been forced to explore it to a particular way, and because the ways that we have to identify ourselves are against normative experience. So it's not about, oh, here's who I am as somebody who's agender. It's, here's who I am, and here's how I know I'm not cis, right? And you have to like use language to make that make sense to cis people so that they think that your gender label is valid in a particular way. And that's, I think, the really hard thing about it. So it might feel like choice, but it's really, it's very different. And it's interesting, Laura, because I know that I've done this activity with you multiple times, right? And I've explained my gender identity in very different ways in different times. And probably the next time I do it, I'll explain it differently in another time. So I know that the first time I did this with you, I said my gender identity is just not very salient to me. I didn't put a label to it, but I was like, it's just not very salient to me. And the last time that I did it, I was like, I really identify as agender because it's not that salient to me. I put a different label to it. It wasn't really that my experience of gender has changed, but the way that I've chosen to put it in that space, or the words that I've kind of used, but knowing very much that how I use those words and how I choose to use those words is going to situate me really differently in terms of how somebody is going to understand who I am based on the words that I use. And I thought that was I think that's just that's part of that kind of context where it feels fluid and where you're code switching and you're thinking differently about the words that you use. And it might feel like a choice, but it's really a nuance about how you're in that moment or in that situation or in that time, feeling comfortable putting yourself out there in a particular way.
Thank you for going into that. I really appreciate it. For anyone listening at home who has maybe never given their gender any thought, I just want to echo something that Paz said, because gender identity is something that we are all choosing. We're either choosing the identity that's assigned to us and we're like embracing that, or we're not. But I just want to make sure that no one at home is taking this idea of identity or like this personal choice related to identity and making it like, well, you're choosing to go against societal norms. And for those of you who can't see me at home, I'm using some air quotes there. But I do think that there's especially historically, there's been a lot of like controversy around identity and orientation and those things being choice versus biological and those sorts of things. So I just appreciate you spending that little extra time on that, just to make sure people who are thinking about this for the first time, because I do remember like the first time this became a conversation for me, there were a lot of questions about, well, and you and Carin both brought this up at the beginning, like in order to understand people with non-normative identities, if you have a normative identity, you need to go back and you need to explore your own identity, because at some point, like you're making a choice more as it relates to expression and presentation and gender roles, but like you're making choices every day. So just maybe from that standpoint, stop othering people as it relates to some of these things. So
yeah. And I think the other thing too is if you're writing characters who have normative identities, explore some of that too, because it's you don't only want to explore the complexity of gender with people who are non-normative, because I don't think that cis people are any less diverse than trans people. It's just that they don't have the language and they're not forced to push it and explain it and make it part of the social context that they're navigating. And so I think one of the things when we were first even talking about this and thinking about writing gender diversity, I think one of the biggest things that Carin and I talked about is that, like, yes, this could be a great way to learn and think about the diversity of trans and non-binary communities. But it's also, if you're only doing that to diversify the way that you're thinking about transness or LGBT identities, then you're really not doing, you're only doing half the story, and you're also probably tokenizing the community by not also exploring gender diversity among cis identities and straight identities as well.
Yeah, I think that Paz, just something that I've learned from my relationship with you and Carin is that like we've been saying, just to reiterate what everyone's already said, my upbringing that tells me there is just a man or woman, that this isn't a spectrum, but almost like a checkbox. Like you're saying, prevents me from having to actually explore who I am, and creates in me pressure on others to check one box or the other. So, and even whether or not I was aware of seeing gender identity as a checkbox, whether or not I was aware of how that impacted others, it does. My awareness is not in question. Like, my awareness is not important when it comes to how it's impacting other people. So I appreciate you really digging into the idea that gender identity is a spectrum, and that it's not just check male or check female, that there is a large variant between, there's a large diversity in how people see themselves and understand their gender. And that the only reason we use male and female is because that is the history from which we have come, not because that is correct. So just to kind of affirm what you're saying and express some appreciation for you spending time here and kind of breaking this out for us.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add one thing real quick, is that it's also, by creating a checkbox, we're also reinforcing it, right? We're also reinforcing that binary. We're also telling people that there's times in which they should never step outside of it. And we feel the ramifications and the repercussions of doing that. Even if you're not trans or non-binary, there might have been a time in a history where being a cisgender person or being a heterosexual person, you remember getting a little too close to that line, right? Because our social and cultural norms are reinforced from a young age, right? It's not just, hey, we said it when you came out, what your genitalia look like. We're going to need to know what bathroom you go in. We're going to need to know where to place you. We're going to need to make sure that, when you're in 4th grade and you're square dancing, we know where to put you, when in gym, what locker room you go in. We have to organize you in a certain way, and we do it and reinforce that all the time. And so,
because if you're different, you're dangerous.
Yeah,
that's what we say. If you're different, you're dangerous.
Yeah, I just wanted to add for writers who are confused about what engaging with the definition of, cisgender is in your writing, what this can often look like is challenging the alpha male stereotype, engaging with men who are vulnerable, which we, especially in romance, we don't often allow representation of that. It can be, the tom girl. These are all really common patterns that are still allowed for in some cases in our cisgendered narrative in at least North America. But those are if you're looking for a starting point, I would say that those are some easily accessible ways to engage with that.
Yeah, and I think that what you're speaking to too gets to kind of the other dimensions. Like, we're kind of talking about gender identity, which is your private experience, but then there's other pieces of how do we express ourselves? What's our gender expression? What are our gender roles? And those are things that vary for trans, non-binary, and cis people as well.
I was going to draw an example from my own writing because I think it may be pertinent for writers, at least. Is I'm in terms of cultural norms. My partner Liz is downstairs right now doing renovations on the house, whereas I'm the one who'll cry at the drop of a hat. A sad television commercial comes on and I'll just weep, because it's so beautiful. So, I mean, very much we ascribe to non-normative behaviors for society. In an early beta reader from one of my novels, when I had my guy who happens to be a werewolf fall on his knees crying in front of the woman that he lost. It's all heterosexual, but he's very much not doing the normal male thing. And I had readers that really balked at that. Like, well, how could this alpha male guy do that? And I actually use that and I doubled down on, no, he is a sensitive guy. And that's his character. And I want to stay true to it, maybe because it was based a little bit on myself. But then that also gave me a marketing. He's an alpha wolf, but a beta human. And so that actually worked I initially balked at him, like, oh my God, I did something wrong. I made the guy cry because he's upset. That doesn't happen. No, it does happen. And so I just found that as you guys are talking about this, I'm coming back to this whole realization is what I needed to do was probably develop his character in a way that you would find it natural that he would have done that rather than it seeming to come out of nowhere. So that was something that I was like, oh, now I have to go back and explore that character in more detail and make it more multidimensional. Thank you.
Yeah. And also to know that the audience, sometimes you're pulling them along, right? Sometimes no matter who it is and how well developed that character is, they're going to be the things that's just not supposed to happen. But by adding that richness and diversity, you're saying it can. And when you introduce one example of it, it's real, right? And so people can start to envision it and say, I guess it can happen because I remember this. Even if it's just through a character or a story, you start to challenge that idea of what you think is going to happen and what should always happen. And I think for me, it's funny because I talk about many times in which gender, or the way my gender is perceived, has been a really vulnerable and hard experience. But I also talk about the fact that, like, you know, when there's these kind of images you have that, like, a man will go to the park caring for his child, and everyone's like, wow, you're the best dad. And, oh, you know, it's like these kind of very reinforced things that, like, I actually get reinforced all the time as someone who, once I sold it, right? Once they bought in to the idea that I was on this masculine side, or on this maleness to people's side, then all of a sudden the fact that I cook, the fact that I do dishes, I mean, pause has really lucked out, you know? So it's like, it's so ingrained in us that, like, when we start doing this alignment normativity, we start pushing this idea that, like, once you get someone to believe it, it still happens, right? If, like, no, people are not still asking me what body parts I have, but then they're like, okay, I bought into that, and now I'm still going to push this maleness on you, and I'm still going to reinforce the fact that, like, doing a domestic chore, or having some responsibility within the home is, like, you know, has never been more an astonishment, amazement, and things like that. So, you know, I mean, I think it's kind of what Paz says sometimes, where it's like, you have to look on the other coin. Not that the discrimination is very real, and more so even if I had other non-normative intersections of identity, like race or things like that. But for me, there's this strange juxtaposition that when people do buy into it, it's still the desire to make you fit into this very like normative thing. So
what's
Oh my
often
God, that's so true. Thank you.
Yeah, when people talk about, like, a same-sex marriage, people or a same-sex people are like, are you the one that wears a dress? Like, which one? Like, they still want to ascribe these really heteronormative and these very male-female kinds of roles, even when that's not really relevant. The whole point is that there maybe isn't a man in that whole situation, but we're still trying to, like, impose these particular ideas
and it's
around
that relative thing. It's that, like, I want to understand it. So if I'm understanding it in my context, please explain it to me in my world, right?
Yeah,
So take what you're saying and tell me, break it down in a way in which I can understand it.
Whereas the reality is, there doesn't need to be a man in the relationship. There doesn't need to be a woman in the relationship. That's a construct. Wow.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too is we're starting to talk around, like, we talked about gender identity, which is just like how you identify with it. And now we're starting to talk around these other two dimensions of thinking about gender. And one is gender expression, right? And that's kind of how you express yourself in terms of being more masculine or feminine, right? And you can sit at any gender identity and present or express in a really masculine way or in a really feminine way or some kind of combination, right? So gender expression often has to do with how you're being read by other people. It might have to do with the clothes you wear or your mannerisms. That doesn't necessarily tell you anything about somebody's gender identity. I think one of the things that people think when they think about trans and particularly non-binary people, they think that if you identify as non-binary, you have to be super androgynous in your gender expression, right? But you could identify as non-binary and present more masculine or more feminine. And so that expectation, again, of alignment in one way or another. So that's the expression piece. And then role is more, it could be personality trait, it could be occupation, it could be the division of labor, like you kind of were speaking to, like what are the roles that you play in one way or another. And so for Carin and I, it's interesting as a couple in some ways, that people will look at us and say, okay, I present in a more feminine way than Carin does. And so they expect, and this is part of what Carin was speaking to, is that then they expect that because Carin presents more masculine, then they should have a particular gender role that matches that in a particular way. So, but gender identity, gender expression, and gender role all can vary independently. And so if you're attending and understanding that gender encapsulates all of those things, there's so many different ways there's so many different ways to be a human, right? And to express gender in all of these really I think, wonderful ways that can be really, really freeing. It's one of the things that I enjoy the most about being a queer person, is that in some ways this gender binary doesn't work, right? And so when we think about our division of labor as a couple, it's not a gendered thing. It's like, who's good at what? And so I often think about my gender role as seeming more masculine in some ways, because for the majority of our relationship, I've been the one who has worked outside the home, and Carin's gender role might be more kind of leaning more in the feminine role because they cook and they stayed home with our kids and they did all of this, but really it just means that Carin kind of does everything and I work outside the home, right? Like, but we've arranged things based on discussion and what we want to do with our lives and how we, like how we want to organize our home, not based on you do that because you're the woman or you're supposed to do that because you're the man. So there's a freedom a lot in giving and not giving power to that binary.
And that fluidity. I mean, I think we kind of talk about the fact that, like, when we're presenting, the characters and you're presenting, and I'm sure as most of you were speaking, you were pulling out specific characters or popping in your own minds, I think, and in your own writing. So you'll probably be able to speak to this even more as we kind of move into other parts of the conversation. But this idea that, like, once we've established a character in a specific dress or style or representation, that they can never move, right? That we don't all have times where we are doing different things in different contexts, right? Where we're like in an athletic setting and we're not wearing a dress or a tux, right? Because we have that fluidity at some point based on social appropriateness. And so we can say that, like, if we took the shorts from a basketball team, in the male basketball team in the 60s, and we tried to put them on the shorts of kids right now, they'd be like, oh, this is what, and it's like, suddenly now it's not male appropriate. Suddenly now that doesn't fit in our context, because we're also having this evolution, and we're also having fashion and other parts of society that gets to tell us what is male at this point. And it can change. And right now your shorts should go past your knees, and other times they were, and women's bathing suits and this and that. And so we're hearing this idea of expression and presentation specifically has this, like, external cultural, and depending on what culture, and Western culture or otherwise, right, we're having this appropriateness of what is appropriate for a female, what is appropriate for a male, and kind of where you should sit in that, right? Because when we go into a store, nothing really makes a t-shirt male, right? It's going to be what's on it. It's going to be a color. It's going to be because it was sitting in that section that says male over top or boy, so, but we're ascribing these things to really inanimate objects. We're telling them that that's only suitable. And if we watch the progression over time, somehow it's been able to change, right? We've all accepted that what we wear in the 60s, maybe it comes back again. People are bell bottoming or something, but ultimately we accept that what somebody else tells us all the time, what should be very maleness, and because it's reinforced by our society, because we know when we wear something that's not.
We're told when it's not appropriate.
Right. We're told when a man wears pink. And then now it's like, oh, no, pink doesn't matter. I'm so secure in my masculinity, I can wear pink from head to toe, right? So it just depends on how we're claiming that and who told us that it's okay and how it was reinforced that it was okay. And so when we try to step outside of it, it's like, how much flack will I get for doing that? And that goes back to that idea of just like, where you are and who you're with. And so, yeah, I think that you see that a lot in gender expression and presentation and gender role, because it's out there for others to consume, critique, and judge.
I'd just add that when y'all first said to me, gender roles are like roles that people have are gendered, my initial, this was years and years ago, my initial response was like, no, they're not. And then, but then as I thought about it, I was like, Oh my gosh, they so are. It's just funny. Like, it feels like, for, if you grew up like me, where there was a hard line presented for what gender is, and it was, the check boxes, one side or the other, and you just kind of assumed that, like, yeah, this is all part of it. And so I find it eye-opening. I see it everywhere now, right? Like, I was just this week, I was watching the TV show Bridgerton on Netflix, and the more masculine sister is the one that is, like, intelligent and wants to read and wants to go to school. And I'm sitting there watching, I'm like, wait, why are those roles assigned to the more masculine character, right? Like, it's that kind of, like, that forcing of the genderization of roles. So just to go back to part of what you said earlier, just to reinforce it for those who, like me, may feel like this is the first time they're hearing this and it's crazy town. This idea that roles are gendered, like Carin was saying, is cultural, right? Like, just to summarize what you were saying, it's a cultural expectation that we've placed upon roles. And we as a culture have said, we consider this role to be more masculine, but it's not, like, written in a book somewhere. It's not something that was, like, determined, like, these are the things that are masculine. We're calling these roles masculine and feminine because we are part of a specific culture that has labeled them that things, but that, like Carin was saying, they change over time and over location. And for example, I grew up in the South. Men cooking in the South is an acceptable masculine role as long as you're cooking outside. That's the, like, the men can do the crawfish broil, but it has to happen outside, right? Like, but if you're, like, cooking dinner every day, well, suddenly it's a feminine thing, right? Like, and all that is like a cultural expectation that my geographic location placed on cooking, right? So sorry, just wanted to jump in there and emphasize a little bit of what you were saying.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful thing too, because you can't say, like, in second grade we had a class where we learned all of these things, right? So it's so subtle, and so I think as writers it's really hard because it's that nuance.
It's subtle, but it's pervasive.
It's
because
true.
It's everywhere, right?
It is.
So everything reinforces it, like, and all of our relationships reinforce it. Like, we learn it from our parents. We learn it when we walk into the store and see what's appropriate boys and girls clothing, or you walk into a toy aisle and you recognize what are the ones that look like Pepto-Bismol pink, right? And what are the ones that look like primary colors. And you might not tell a kid which one is the appropriate one, but they know, right? And they get these subtle, but also hit you over the head cues.
Absolutely.
About what's important.
Even from before a child is born, right? What's your kid? Because I can only get it a blue blanket. I can only get it, like, so it is subtle and it's pervasive, but then when you're doing it in a story with characters, and you have to decide the words in which you're using to introduce it. I'll say that we were fortunate enough to actually listen to the podcast that you all did earlier on gender, and it was great, and I loved hearing this. You all talking about it in terms of, like, characters and writing, and really telling people, because I heard at one point that I think, JP, you said you don't run into a room and scream your orientation, right? And so you kind of have to find a way, like, how do you capture this subtle nuance that's pervasive in a story? And so I really loved, we really loved hearing that part. And in general, just kind of what's out there, because it is a challenging thing that at times can seem so daunting. You're just like, well, why start? If I don't do it right, or if I want to do it right, and I don't want it to be a disservice, right? And so I want to, and so how to start writing this out and how to start integrating it. Those are questions that I guess I pose, but I have no answer to. But it is like, how do you do it without reinforcing these very, these ideas that, like, if it's a lesbian, they're going to be they're going to be in boots with some kind of plaid, right? If it's, we're going to hypersexualize it because we don't know how to talk about some kind of sexuality without making sure that it might not be appropriate for them to walk into a room and scream it, but if they go to pick up someone at a bar, you'll immediately know that they're gay, right? So we find subtle ways to try to reinforce it, but then we're also reinforcing these the alignment of this is what you should be, and playing on the assumptions. And so it is a challenging thing to kind of take on.
I have a question that kind of stems off that, and that is like a very current times need question. Societally, for readers, for society, right now, where do you feel the balance lies as far as how explicitly you engage, like the society needs engagement, as far as the book that's coming to mind, and I'm saying this so complicated because I don't have the clarity in my brain about this. The book that comes to mind immediately is there's a book called Deeds of Poxenarian. There's a series by Elizabeth Moon. And the character is queered, asexual, possibly aromantic, but because in this world, like those weren't necessarily anything that ever was stated explicitly, it's coded. It is never said explicitly on the page. Because there is again a spectrum of how explicitly you can engage with this as a writer. And all of them are valid engagements depending on the story you're going to tell. But is there a level that you feel is needed more right now, as far as how explicitly this is engaged with versus subtly coded? I don't even know if there's an answer to this, but I'm really curious in what you think.
I think there's a lot of, and this is just my first kind of thought, and who knows if I'll change it after we get off of this conversation, but my first thought is there's a lot of value in some ways there's a lot of mistakes that you can make in being really explicit, right? Because once you're explicit, it situates in one particular place, and there's a lot of ways to maybe do that wrong, and there's a lot of ways that you could also do that right. I think there's a lot of interesting ways of kind of being open. It's kind of like what we were talking about earlier about just leaving things neutral, not having to say things, or not having to situate them so specifically, but making it clear that maybe it's not normative, right? Like opening up that possibility, or not drawing these really strong gendered assumptions and leaving things open for the possibility. Because I think one thing that happens is that readers are going to, if things aren't so gendered, readers are going to place themselves also in that and see if there's variability in the parameters in which you're writing about gender, and you say partner, then multiple readers might assume in different ways, right? And you allow that imagination to be open. And then maybe you do bring a cue in later to be like, okay, this is how they identify. But it doesn't have to be that like it's explicit, especially if somebody's non-normative, that every time you're talking about them, you're talking about the ways that their gender is, being negotiated in that space, rather than just opening the container. Opening the container to be more neutral and to not have those gendered assumptions. I think there's a lot of play in that. And there's a lot of, it just gives space for the possibility in a way that what I tend to see is there's stories that are written from these very gendered assumptions where people might not even know and think that they're writing a gendered story because they're just writing, kind of unconsciously the stories that we kind of tell in society, right? And then there's people who are like, I want to make a queer character, or I want to make a non-normative character. And so now I'm going to move and I'm going to take all that language of that community and make sure that I kind of get that in there, which can feel really empowering to have like this very queer centered kind of story. But again, I think now we're creating another binary, right? We're creating literature or images that are absent of diversity. And then we're saying, now I'm going to write something that is the most diverse, or that is very consciously diverse and is engaging in that, which I think there's a lot of value for. But I also think that there's a ton of value in being like, yeah, I'm going to write a story where maybe maybe the ways in which people are interacting with one another is just not following a gendered script. And we're not really labeling what their gender identity is. There's so much about gender too that's social, like when we were talking about having, like somebody having a baby, right? Like you imagine if that baby is a boy versus a girl, you imagine a particular relationship that you're going to have with them, right? We bring ourselves, and I think we all do this. We want to know who we're interacting with because we know we're going to bring a different aspect of ourselves if that person is male or female, because it either feels safe, because it's socially appropriate to bring ourselves in that way. And so I think there's a lot of play in opening up a lot of these other dimensions without feeling like I have to write a diverse character right now. And so I don't know, that's my gut reaction. Those are the stories that I think I would be interested in. I'm always wondering, like, what would it be like to interact with people where I don't have to be this self-conscious, where I don't have to wonder. It's just kind of, I can read a situation and read that those assumptions aren't going to be so policed. And that feels really freeing to me. So maybe that's me selfishly being like, that's the literature that I want to read. Rather than I need to have a character who has all of my same identities and is going to tell my story. I mean, I don't necessarily feel like, I've never read a story like that. And maybe that would be fun for me, but I'm looking for something that's also going to let me imagine kind of a world beyond this. And I know a lot of you are also writing kind of in the more like sci-fi, also kinds of things that allow for and have allowed for gender. But even if when you said kind of romance, I'm thinking like there's such a intimacy, right? When we're thinking about romance or we're thinking about our social relationships, there's intimacy that's so gendered. And to play with like, what would that space look like where I don't even know, but I would love to read a book that makes me be like, wow. Jeanette Winterson, I don't know if you've ever read, I can't remember the book, but it's a book where it's a kind of a love story and you actually never know the gender of the narrator. And and you know that they're in love with somebody and they're talking about this person and you have no idea the gender of the people, but the love story is so strong. And for me, that was like anybody could kind of place themselves there and not get locked into a gendered way of interacting.
And I think that comes down to like when I was saying earlier is like the intention, right? Like the intentionality of the situation, like, because I think if you watch, excuse me, the documentaries Disclosure or a couple other ones that are out there, right? You're going to see this chronicling of representation. You're going to see what it's like to introduce characters and at what point in which like people will accept characters, right? Will accept, prostitutes, will accept you in this role. But if you're that role, no, that doesn't make sense to me, right? So there always has to be a first, right? And so there always has to be this, but I think the intention of writing it, right? So, as a reader and a consumer, I've been finding stories of tomboys or people that I found that I could connect to in story, whether they really shared my identity or not. It was just they were placed, right? Because I was looking for that. I was looking for a connection. If you're an author, I think for me, I often remind myself that character can't be everything to everyone, right? And so that, you have to be okay with telling a part of that story. And I think, but if you are writing a story because it needs to be, because it makes sense to be subtle and it makes sense that it is just one aspect of their whole identity, and then that's good, right? If you're writing the aspect of that story because you're subtle, because you're hoping that part of the queer community picks up on the vibe that they're kind of right. We hear, in the Harry Potter series, right, where there's like subtle, like, yeah, I mean, if you're in the gang, you kind of knew that, Dumbledore was queer or something like that, right? So like, but if you didn't, it was subtle enough that you could miss it. It didn't piss people off, right? So like, it was just like, is that your intention? And if it is, okay, and own it. But it's like, it's the muddled in between that gets uncomfortable. It gets tokenizing because you're like, hey, I'd really like to reach a wider audience. Okay, that's not a horrible reason to do it, right? If you want to tell a story because people deserve to have stories out there and to see themselves in the world, great. But it's really that you have to spend the time to be intentional, because I think, Mark mentioned it earlier when somebody questioned you about your character, your werewolf, right? And it's like, what is the intention? Why did we make those decisions, right? And so I think when we had a training not too long ago, and there was a whole conversation about like, why would we put our pronouns in our signature line? Why would we do that? And so we talked about, normalizing the experience and making sure that you weren't just asking some people, but all people, that you were saying that by email, really it's all assumption, right? If my name is something that we would perceive as always being feminine, right? If I'm Carin, right? But if I'm Kelly, well, it could be a man or a woman, right? We start to see certain names that we're not sure, right? If we're seeing Lee, Lee or Leigh, right? If we're starting to see these names, like, how does that benefit other people, right? How does that, and also these ideas that when you're creating this, that idea that it's normalized, that everyone's doing. I'm not asking you because you're a special case. I'm not asking you because I couldn't figure you out, right? It's like, and because I don't want to make assumptions. I want to make space for everyone. So I think it's that intentionality for me over why you're choosing to do it. And if somebody asked you why you put your pronoun there, is it an authentic answer? Like, because if it's the answer that I just, I want people to know how to address me, great. If it's an answer, whatever that answer is, it's okay to some degree, as long as you have one.
I think it speaks back to that idea of also being really conscious. So we talked about like the idea of, okay, when we're thinking about gender, cisgender people tend to be unconscious about gender. So if you're writing gender and you're really thinking about it in this multidimensional way, can you also defend your character? Can you define your character in a conscious way? Because then they'll kind of come to life. But if you're writing gender in a unconscious way, you're probably going to rely on all those stereotypes, and you're actually probably going to just keep telling the same story as well, because you're going to tell this very scripted heterosexual cisgender kind of story. But I think as you open the space, allowing yourself or doing whatever that research is to be more conscious so that you can answer those questions when people do come back to you and say, hey, well, that doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem legit. You have an alpha character who's crying, but you were able to answer it because you had a consciousness of why you were writing it that way. And so I think that as you write more diversely, thinking of and challenging yourself to be more conscious of maybe the more privileged positions where you're coming from, if you're pulling yourself kind of out of that, would be helpful, because then I think then you are more nuanced. What I love about my research in the queer community is that queer people have the language, because they've been asked so many times, their language and their understanding of sexuality is really strong. They can tell you things that straight people haven't, because they haven't been challenged about it. It's not that they don't have the diversity, they just don't have the language for it yet. And so I think becoming more conscious of it and allowing, even questioning your own genders and sexualities and your own, all of these things, not just gender and sexuality, but thinking about how does your gender expression read? When do you modify that and why? And how do you show up differently? How do people react to you differently when you present in one way versus the other, or when you're in a role that's different from the other? That becomes really important.
And I think we see that in gender, but then, and what we haven't really got to yet is this idea of sexual orientation and attraction. And I think there's where oftentimes, like Laura was mentioning earlier, we get it conflated, right? Because we base your sexual orientation on whoever you are dating's gender and your gender, right? Or, so this is how we start to see that. And the difference between having an orientation and an attraction is very, is a recognizable difference and charted differently.
Okay, on that note, I'm going to pause this. That was beautiful. But before we get into orientation and attraction, let's take we've been sitting for an hour and 45 minutes. Let's take a 7-minute break and come back in 7 minutes and pick up where we left off. Is that okay with everybody?
That's perfect.
All right, I'm going to pause the recording and we'll come back in 7 minutes from now.
In writing, do you want me? Oh, you already turned the recording back on.
I turned the recording back on.
Yeah, but you do this thing where you go, I'm going to turn the recording back on. Is everybody okay with that? Oh, wait, it's already on. If anybody
That is what I do.
All right, well, now it's on the recording. I had a thought about writer's responsibility as it relates to diverse characters. It's not just about the characters themselves that we are responsible for. It's about the characters around the diverse characters that we have to make sure that we're being responsible for. There's this idea of, somebody brought it up a little while ago that we don't just run into rooms and shout our identities. And Carin and Paz talked a lot earlier when we first started about this idea of code switching. And most of the time that code switching happens from a safety perspective. If I'm understanding correctly, it's like this, I'm negotiating because of, and JP, you shared a little bit of your experiences like that as well. So I think that I kind of have two thoughts as it relates to our responsibility as writers. The first one is that if we're creating characters and we want to put their identity out into the world, then we're responsible for everybody else's reaction to it. And if you, Carin mentioned the Disclosure documentary on Netflix. Historically, the response to trans characters in media as it relates to disclosure is horrifying. And that's creating this idea in the world. And for a long time, there was a defense that you could murder a trans individual if they didn't disclose their identity to you early enough. And these are terrible things that are happening in the world. So as writers, it's our responsibility to show an acceptance in our world, not just for who our characters are, but in the way that they're being perceived. And not to say that we shouldn't create authentic experiences because minorities of every persuasion, whether it's racism, ethnicity, gender, ableism, any sort of minority group, there are terrible experiences, but there needs to kind of be this flip side to it where we're also showing an acceptance and that sort of thing. So I guess that's both of my thoughts together. I feel like there was a discrete second thought, but I kind of got distracted by it. So, but that's just kind of my thought as it relates to writing diversity in characters.
Yeah, I think we can try to take you through. So we've talked in some ways about the different dimensions of gender, assigned sex, gender identity, talked through gender expression, gender role. And the reason that there's these two other dimensions that have to do with sexuality, and Laura, you said it, is that we often conflate sexual orientation or sexuality and gender. I'm putting them in kind of the mix here because the way that we talk about sexual orientation and sexuality is gendered inherently. And so the nomenclature that we use is rooted on a gender binary. And so there's, in some ways, that might be part of the reason why that conflation kinds of occurs. And so I think it's important to include it in this dimension so that we can see how it is discrete. So when we think about sexual orientation, it's kind of similar to how we think about gender identity. When we think about sexual identity, it is the, and actually when we think about sexual orientation, we think about it as including behavior, attraction, right, and identity. And so when we're thinking about sexual identity, it's your own private experience and your own labels that you might put to what's meaningful for you in terms of your sexuality. The labels that we traditionally use are based, it's interesting because it's the only identity that we have that the label that you're choosing is based on somebody else's identity, right? So for you to have a sexual orientation label, you have to identify yourself in a traditional way on a binary gender, and the people who you're attracted to on a binary gender. And the labels that we use speak to how well those align. So somebody who is heterosexual is going to identify with one, like as a woman who is attracted then to a man, right? Or a man who's attracted to a woman, but it's presupposing that binary identification. When we think of somebody who's gay, again, we're thinking of somebody who identifies as a man who is attracted to men, right? So we're taking that label, expecting gender binary for both the person and the other, and bi would be the idea that it's somebody who is attracted to both. Notice again that it's still only expecting that you can be male or female in a particular way. All of the other there are a lot of other labels that kind of get us outside of that binary. We can think about pansexual, we can think about queer. I will say that bi is not inherently binary, right? So that just because somebody identifies as bi doesn't necessarily mean that they subscribe to a gender binary, although that's a stereotype that we often have of bisexual individuals. But because of that binary and because of that conflation and because of alignment normativity, we expect that if we know what your gender identity is, that we know what would be appropriate for your sexual identity. Because of that alignment normativity, that's the basis of heterosexism. And it's part of why sexuality often gets included kind of in this matrix of gender mapping in one way or another. So we have sexual identity, again, which is your own private kind of identity label for your sexuality, which may or may not easily fall from your attraction. So, right, you could have two people who have different spectrums in terms of who they're attracted to and have the same label. Or you could have two people who have different labels but have the same attraction kinds of levels. And so just because somebody identifies as heterosexual doesn't mean that they don't have some same-sex attraction or attraction to people of other genders. And so again, that reliance, that deep, deep reliance of defining sexuality based on gender is what aligns it in this way, which is really interesting because I often do an activity with people and I just say, you know, what are you attracted to in people? And often gender is not the first thing that people say. They'll say, oh, you know, sometimes they'll say body parts, I'm a butt person, or I like boobs or whatever. But like a lot of times people are like, I'm just really attracted to sense of humor. I really love when somebody is, you know, like a lot of times attraction really isn't based on gender in any way, but our system culturally of defining sexuality around gender is what allows us in some ways to easily kind of conflate this idea of sexuality and gender in another way. When we're looking at these different aspects of gender, all of which we see kind of on a binary, we really see that alignment normativity where we expect, if we know assigned sex, that we think that gender identity should align with that. That's kind of the basis of cis normativity, right? The idea that we think that if we know assigned sex, that we know what the appropriate gender identity would be. We see sexism embedded in it. We think that if we know your gender identity, we know what is the appropriate gender role or the appropriate gender expression, right? And then we see the heterosexuality embedded in this kind of system, this binary system, where we think if we know your gender, we know what's appropriate in terms of your sexuality or attraction. And so seeing kind of this completeness, it allows you to see the power dimension of gender. So it allows us to see that there's so much variability for everybody, but that power comes in when we start kind of enforcing our assumptions of alignment normativity on other individuals. And then the only last piece that we have kind of on this matrix or this map is this idea of legal sex, which is this idea that, and that sometimes we expect that legal sex is the same thing as assigned sex, but it's really about what your documents say your gender to be. Often those documents, and a lot of documents enforce a gender binary. So birth certificates, passports, those types of things. We actually live in Maryland, and in Maryland now on your driver's license, you can have a legal sex of X. And so it's not always binary, but for a lot of trans and non-binary individuals, a lot of times when you change your documents, you might have multiple documents that have different legal gender markers. And often that puts you in a compromised situation. Also, if you're somebody who is trans, who is like a trans man, for example, but your identity marker says female on your documents, that's something that becomes a safety concern, and it's something that could kind of also out you. Your gender marker on your medical insurance, those types of things also really dictate what types of healthcare you're able to have, and are really the source of a lot of discrimination, because your legal documents in a lot of ways can out your trans status in a particular way. And so I love thinking about gender because it in this map kind of way, because it allows us to really interrogate the ways in which that gender binary doesn't capture lived experience really of any community, but also helps us identify the source of discrimination and the source of other parts of experiences when you fall in non-normative identities, and how those kind of come to play, particularly because our expectations of all these different aspects of gender, we expect them to line up in one way or another. I think we're gonna skip doing our own gender maps. Oh, how do I do this? But I did want to show you one thing. Yeah, I think we can go through.
Pause just before you skip doing gender maps,
Sure.
because I know this was important. Just thinking through people who might be hearing this for the first time, just to kind of sum up what you've been talking about. When we look at these seven spectrums, it's highly unlikely that someone is going to fall entirely on one side of the spectrum. Yeah. Right? Because even like myself, you have pictures of it. Okay, I'll just let you talk.
That's exactly what I was just going to pull up. What I'm showing you here is a gender map of just people from my class last semester, and there were plenty of people who had all different identities. And you notice, and there were a lot of people who were cisgender and heterosexual. And what you notice is when they mapped out their own experiences, nobody actually had the up and down expectation of everything aligning up really neatly. And so I think that that's such an important thing, because we want to think about gender diversity and think, that's something like that happens in the queer community. But no, it actually happens for everybody. And so I think that's where it's really helpful to kind of interrogate your own experiences of gender and kind of place it along, okay, let me really think about this idea of gender identity, and let me think about my gender expression, and why do I feel pressure to present myself in certain ways. I often talk about the fact that what we consider dressing up, or what we consider professional dress, is really just becoming more gendered, right? dressing up means that you go out in a way that people then can recognize you easier in terms of gender. And we don't always present ourselves in those ways. And so just thinking about our own experiences of gender allows us to see that this is not something that is outside of us. Gender is not outside of us. It's not something that other people have. It's something that we all really have an intimate relationship with. And I think if we see the depth in ourselves, then it'll be easier to also think about that in others, especially when we're writing about other individuals as well.
Yeah, and I think that for us, we won't walk through each individual one because we've talked about them, but I think it's important to see and when we do this and have this conversation with people, they're always like, okay, so this is the map. So I just have to find myself right here. I have to just figure out where to put my dot, right? And so then we put our map up and it's like squiggle line, an H, in this, we cross words out, we put other things in because again,
it doesn't fit.
It doesn't fit even as we're trying to do this, right? So there's still this desire to kind of create this it's like even as much as we resist or we try to find, it's like there's this desire to keep pulling you back into this, I know I'm a square peg, but I really want to fit into that round hole. So if I could just figure out where to put myself. And so I think the only real reason to kind of bring up our maps is to kind of see how differently and how we still do not feel like this is going to capture everything for everyone, right? And so if we're really challenging it, we want to say that we understand, in terms of gender expression, when Paz is saying you see that those two little lines, right? In this kind of gender expression idea, right? On this continuum going towards feminine, there's really a small area in which Paz really would want to be in there, and it's understanding, and that's kind of what we mentioned earlier, is this idea is that when we say male and female, even on these continuums, there's a wide range of them, and it would even be up to us to decide where we would put ourselves and what does this, and even if you broke down any one of these lines, right, this masculine, right, what is this, it's kind of like a Likert scale, right? You got to find out what your point is and what your other point is, so you can find out what it actually means. And so when we talk about interrogating or really looking at it, it's like you kind of have to name it and you have to put it out there in a way. And if it doesn't fit, you create squiggles, you write all, you say humans, you put a line above the line, you put a dot above the line because you want to make sure that, and you do those things because
the language doesn't capture it and culture doesn't really capture what and it's interesting because as writers, you're limited in some ways by language, right? You're limited in terms of thinking about that, but think about how much our language is gendered, even when we're talking about, we think of it, and early on in psychology we talked about the opposite sex, right? We don't talk about that anymore. We might say other sexes, or we might not say the other sex. We'll say all, there's multiple genders, and just shifting our language in those more open ways allows for the imagination and the possibility of something else. But even using the language that we've been trained to use. And one of the things I do have kind of at the end that I really urge people to look at is the Radical Copy Guide. Let me see if you go all the way to the end. The Radical Copy Editor's Style Guide to Writing About Trans People is really helpful because it'll kind of show you what is our traditional language. And it's almost like a copy editor. It'll show sentences and then it'll cross out, okay, why is that not a good thing to say? How else could I say it? Because sometimes it's really hard to imagine, how do we alter our language to not be really binary in gender? And so for me, that's really helpful to be like, oh yeah, I would have said that because that's what we've been trained to say. And here's how it could be said differently that allows for more gender diversity. So for me, that's a really good resource in a particular way.
And I think that it's there's also, we prefaced it by saying there's a certain aspect of lived experience, and you can take it from.
Yeah, I'm stop sharing now.
But there's like lived experience, and we know that it's not everyone's. Might not have a close personal friendship, right? It might not have a person that they could bounce ideas off of, or who could read, and kind of work through and give feedback, and so I think it is important how those social circles are created and formed, and who's reading and editing and working through pieces, and who's in and creating these like brainstorm circles, like how information is coming out there, and who's talking about it. Because I think for us, when you're having sometimes just by learning the language of what other people say, it's not enough, right? Because we have to understand in what context, or especially like I would say in like romance novels, right? Like if we're talking about what's body affirming to a trans and non-binary person, it's going to be very different, right? And so that experience might not translate, right? It might not be and I heard you talk about it in the beginning, right? This idea of like, what is our illusion? We're reading a romance novel to find the ideal, or to find something that's magical, or something that, and so I think it is interesting when we start to write characters and say, how realistic does it need to be? And what story am I trying to tell, right? Because I think,
who am I trying to tell it to?
Right. And I think that, because I think that there's we had a conversation with a friend who was writing regarding someone who is socially transitioned. So someone who is binding, someone who is, when I say social transitions, it means like, asking people to use a different name than maybe you were given at birth, or things like that. And so I think, we start to get into this idea of how people are respecting that character, and how people are able to allow them to define themselves. But again, we start to see somebody saying like, well, and this is their dead name, and this is their this, and it's like, well, that's appropriate, but it's nobody would actually refer to that name as their dead name, or like, so I mean, I think there's things that it's challenging, because we're kind of saying all of these things, and I think we've been very careful not to say don't do this and don't do that, because we want to do, right? We want to go, we want to create a time where we're not self-regulating to the point where we're afraid to do it, right? And I think that and so it's going to be different, but I don't know how you expand your circles, and so maybe that would be more for the writers who write in this way to kind of talk through. But I know that there's a fear of reinforcing stereotypes, and there's a fear of and it kind of leads people to just not do it.
Yeah, I'm interested in just what this brings up in terms of what does this bring up in terms of thinking about, developing character, or how much you feel you're already consciously kind of thinking through these things? Because it feels like I loved how much conversation we were having as we were kind of going through it. So.
And I want to just address what Carin said for a minute about how to expand your circle, because I know as somebody who grew up in a fairly closed circle of kind of, white evangelicalism, where things were all binary. For me, I had to come to a place where I started learning about other people out of a deep love for other people, as opposed to a self-justification. And so, we talk a lot about intention, and I would say that if you're expanding your circle in order to elevate yourself, or justify yourself, then self-examine before you before you bring other people into that mess. But if you're expanding your circle out of a deep love for other people and a desire to learn about other people, for your self-evolution, that's a good place to start, right? Like I know that's more on a philosophical level, but for me, it's translated into writing as well, right? Like if I'm writing diversity in order to prove something about myself or prove something about my work, maybe not, right? If I'm writing diversity in order to speak to people that my work is safe and that they are safe to read my work and that I value and respect them as readers and who they are, then maybe explore, right? Like for me, that's the line I've drawn, right? Like I'm not, but that's me. I'd love to hear what everyone else kind of has gone in this direction.
I want to add to what you're saying, Jeff, because first of all, I love this idea that like we're expanding because of a love of people as opposed to like a need to fill a diversity box, right? Like we all want to feel like we are not subscribing to white supremacist culture. So the immediate response to, well, I'm not a racist is because I have an ex friend, right? Like we've all heard that. And we want to move away from this idea that one person that we know who's diverse checks our diversity boxes. And for some of this, Paz mentioned earlier that sometimes when you hear these things for the first time, it's like really emotionally charged. And, like this idea that I'm a good person, so it means all of these things. So like there's some reflection that needs to happen surrounding this. But beyond that, like as you start expanding your circles and as you start creating new friendships and new relationships, please don't use that person as your only resource. And you may have a ton of questions, but don't ask all of your questions. Like there are things that, like, if you don't want to answer questions about your own body parts, don't ask somebody else about theirs, right? Like there are thousands of resources out there. You have Google. Like if you want to have a relationship with somebody, be respectful of that person and their boundaries. And you may at some point in your relationship explore some of these things, but in the same way that Jeff is talking about like, don't go out and get these relationships because of that. Like once you have them, be respectful. Like people have feelings and like they shouldn't be tokenized. So.
Yeah, people are not here for your science experimentation questions, right? Like people are people. So treat people as people. And if you have science experimentation questions, like Laura said, there's plenty of ways for you to research without going to find people and making them into your, token friend that's going to explain token things to you.
Well, I think it's important that when you're asking a question is, would you ask this question of A if you're asking it of B? And that's a good place to start. The other thing I think, as Laura was saying this, it was reminding me, if you have a friend who identifies as whatever it is, they're not necessarily representative of everyone who identifies as that. There is such complexity and diversity. I mean, I can think of friends that I have who would identify as the same term that you would use in general, but they are so dramatically different from one another that person A would not react that way, but person B would. And I think I love that you showed the gender map. That was phenomenal. I can't wait to do one for myself because it'll help me understand there's a lot more complexity than I've ever really paid attention to in terms of how I've identified in different contexts in different ways. But I think that's a great place to start, is looking at oneself and saying, wait a second, it's not all as cut and dry as I've been told. I grew up in Wonderbread in Northern Ontario, small community where there was no racial diversity. There was no other sexual identity other than the strict binary, right? That was just not, it didn't like very much like what Jeff talks about. So I'm I've spent a lot more of my adult life exploring and listening and trying to understand that. But I have to remember, just because I have one friend, I have one friend who's a cop who behaves this way doesn't mean all cops behave that way. right? Or one friend who's a surgeon who does one thing or the other. So I think it's important for us when we are writing diverse characters to pay attention to the nuances between people in general. I don't know. That's just something that I keep thinking about.
Yeah, and
Yeah, I was gonna say go for it. The thing that's come up for me in my brain is it's extremely natural to have a very powerful sense of curiosity when you start exploring this. And you just want to kind of, some people like me want to learn all the things. And my journey probably started with Wikipedia and learning about all the cultural histories of different gender definitions. You don't need to start there, but and JP and I talk about this in that episode that you guys referenced earlier, but one of the best ways to get to the point where you go from seeing someone as their gender identity and their sexuality because it is so other for you is to simply engage with media where you see many different people of many different expressions and representations. YouTube is actually really amazing for this. And the more you see it, the more normal it becomes for you. That way, when you do meet someone who is outside of your understanding of normativity, it is much easier to see them as the human they are rather than the new things you're not aware of.
Very true. And I think that, we see that too when people are transitioning and have changed either, or their pronouns have evolved, or they're asking, or their name is different. We often say, talk about them when they're not with you, right? In your house, say, I wonder if Carin would like this. They don't usually like blue, but I think they do, right? So you have to do things to yourself, just like you're saying, and practice it, right? Because that's how you're not going to do it and be like, and say, and use a pronoun that is not affirming, right? And so it doesn't happen. Just because it didn't happen automatically doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It means that there is a learning curve, and how we're experiencing it and how we consistently do it, and how we know how to acknowledge missteps, and how we know how to have these conversations is such a key part of this, because relationships and really what people are writing about are so dynamic. You can have these very subtle things that can be telling, right? And so when we say it all the time, it's like it feels very I was talking to someone and they said, oh, that feels very weird just to talk about someone in your house, and you're just kind of like, I wonder if they would like this meal. And it's like, yeah, but you're because you'd rather do it that way than have them. You'd rather feel that it was a little for your own self, that it felt weird, than what it would feel like to misgender a person in front of their face, right? And so there are tips and tricks, but I think, and everybody seems to have their own. I love hearing about them, because I think it is the kind of social workarounds that we do, and those strategies that really show investment and show what we're doing. Because it normalizes that it doesn't just happen for everybody, right? I mean,
and you will fuck up. Accept you will fuck up, and that doesn't. And I hope I'm allowed to swear. And that doesn't make you a bad person.
Just learning, right? Where we yes, it's about curiosity and learning about other communities and learning about other experiences, but it's also about unlearning all those assumptions that we make. It's unlearning alignment, our expectations that are dictated out of alignment, normativity, and what we've kind of learned in such a pervasive way about the gender binary that. So it does take practice. It does mean catching ourselves. I love, Mark, when you were also talking about, doing the map for yourself, because how can you understand where somebody else is positioned if you don't know where you're positioned? And that's where I was like really trying to begin with this idea of positionality, because gender is such a social and interactional kind of exchange. And so you might think that you're trying to figure out where somebody else is, but how somebody else presents themselves and how they feel free to present themselves is dependent upon where you are. And if you don't know where you are and you're not conscious of that, then it's really hard for you to get a handle on somebody else, because you don't understand the assumptions that you're coming from. And so there is a piece of like, do your own work, right? You got to do your own work, not just about learning about other people, but about learning about yourself and your positionality and your intentions, I think, as a writer. And, you know, I think about this as a researcher also. Like, there's a lot of different ways that you could approach doing research. My way of doing it is by wanting to elevate the voices of people who aren't necessarily heard. But for me to do that well, I have to know what my position is. I have to know what my intentions are. I have to know. And I think that is something that's also important, even if you're writing fiction as well, is like, know who you are. Why would you write about gender otherwise? Like, be conscious of your own gender and your own positionality, and then it'll be authentic, because ultimately I think that's what we want. We want to write authentic stories. We want to elevate authentic stories. So
Yeah,
I wanted to add this, just going back to what we were saying about familiarizing yourself with other stories for the extroverts out there, because I tend to lean towards very introverted, research-oriented advice. If you're an extrovert who learns by speaking with people, look for the people who are next to the type of person you want to learn about, like someone you might have a relationship with already, who is your friend, who is also friends with a transgender person, with an intersex person, and ask them if they would be comfortable helping you figure some stuff out. They may not, and that's okay. But if you are the kind of person who needs to talk to someone, the best people to go to ask about these things are not always first the people that you're wondering about, because they're already defending themselves all the time and explaining themselves all the time. But the people who are the connection between them and you are often really good people to talk to.
I think, as someone that's even part of the LGBTQIA community, otherwise known as the Alphabet Mafia, I think that I even have that hesitation to write these characters because I'm worried about the justice that I'll do for them. But I'm part of that community. And so I'm taking more of this active step of just creating these realistic, marginalized characters within my fiction, because they need to have that voice. I want that voice in my fiction because I missed out on that when I was growing up, and I don't want others to. So I think it's fair for me to say that, yeah, you might screw it up too, but you know, we're all in this together and we all grow. And the only way we grow is through conversations like these. And, you know, I took a look at Paz's, some of her articles. They're fantastic. I highly recommend that you look her up and you read her articles, because they will just give you that voice of other people who've spoken. So that's my recommendation.
yeah, thank you for that. I mean, most of my articles are quotes of participants talking about their experiences. And I mean, that's why I do the research, is to write those results sections where it's like, here's people who nobody really ever asks them these questions, and allowing that to be kind of part. So even if you just read the results, to hear, like, I mean, when we're working on together kind of the simulation for writing for a simulation for therapists and working with trans and non-binary individuals. And so a lot of the research that we relied on was the research where we asked trans people, like, what were the, you said I can cuss, right? What were the fucked up things that your therapists have said to you, right? And what were the good things that they've said to you? And then we used that with, and helped use that to create some of that dialogue that is authentic, that is real things that people have actually experienced. And so that lived experience, I think, is really invaluable.
And I think it's interesting too, and I'll kind of throw it up because I know JP did put something in a chat. And so I think if people are listening, we won't hear it. But I think but we also spend a little time won't hear it. So if we spend a little time talking about this idea of, because positive research is there's some obviously discrimination, but there's also affirmations. And so we tend to cast characters in these very defined roles. And we also tend to, while it's a very lived and real experience, we see stories that are characters that are their most ideal selves, but we're still churning out trans and non-binary characters who are depressive and suicidal, and so I think that when we start to play with this idea, I wondered if people wanted to talk a little bit about that, of doing the characters and the stories a real and an honesty to it, right? To that we owe the community, if you will. Or I think being inside the community, I feel that pressure. But in the same respect, to be real and to tell people what it's really like to live in the gray, to live in the margins of the world. But also, I don't want people to miss out on the real beauty I have in my life, right?
The joy of it.
And so we want to talk, we want to see the gender dysphoria, and we want to see the gender euphoria. And so we really want to kind of play that and talk about it. So I wasn't sure if people had anything that they wanted to say, either about a character or a thought in their writer's story, or what they've seen.
I think just because we're mentioning about that comment, so I mentioned the movie that came out last year, The Happiest Season, which is about a lesbian couple who goes home to meet one of the person's parents. And in that, they have this couple, regardless of how it ended, which wasn't great. They have these two other characters within the movie. They have the sassy gay friend whose partner doesn't exist. And then they also have the lesbian mentor whose partner is off screen. And they solely exist as these caricatures of the LGBT community. And it's almost as if the movie is pandering to the public by just reducing the actual romance on screen for LGBT characters to make it more palatable, which I just don't agree with that concept. I think, yes, it's a good introduction, I guess, to the world, but I think that we're a little past that point, and we really just need to create these characters who, maybe they're a baker whose mother died and they're working on funeral plans, and they happen to be a lesbian. It's not a story about the fact that they are a lesbian. It's just part of their being.
I would say Discovery has probably some of my favorite, Star Trek Discovery has some of my favorite representations, even though they did kill off one of their gay characters. Spoiler. They kind of fixed that. Spoiler. And they also have a non-binary character. And these are things that matter to the characters because of who they are, but they don't matter to the story most of the time, other than the fact that these two characters are in a relationship, and that affects story plots. And I'm going to misquote Disclosure, but the idea that they said was this: the answer to problematic representations is simply more representation. Then the problematic representation just has that much less weight.
Yeah, I think part of what we're talking about is kind of like, for a long time, this was true of female characters with the Bechdel test in movies of like, does your female character exist just to talk about the men that are around them? Or does your character exist to actually express like Carin said, the euphoria and joy of a specific lifestyle? Yeah, so and also just to say, we should probably say spoiler before we spoil it.
I know.
I'm just teasing you, Chris. That's great. Just teasing.
That just comes in the audio edit after where you pause and go, spoiler alert.
Yeah, except I don't edit. You guys are better podcasters than I am. I don't edit anything. It just goes up how it is. All right, well, so I just want to pause. I feel like we're kind of coming to a wrap. So I just want to stop for a second and say thank you to Paz and Carin for just leading us through this amazing discussion today. I think it was fantastic, and you are both fantastic, and I appreciate you giving us your time and energy. It was really great. Yeah. Anyone have any final thoughts before we stop the recording?
I mean, I think for us, I mean, just that it's a priority and a desire, and people are seeking this information, right? I mean, it's like, I loved the balance, right? It didn't feel invited in the sense that, of course, we had a structure and a PowerPoint. I mean, who does that? But I mean, in the sense that it was a real conversation, because everybody had a perspective and has been working through this in their own way and has been writing and evolving and thinking about this. I mean, I think when we both got the list of who we're on today, we internet stalked and had a great time getting to know where everybody is and where they're coming from, and just like the diversity of people in the room today. It's really, it really speaks to a level of like, we loved catching your podcast and like hearing that this is out there and a priority in general, right? It's not just, we should probably do this. This would be a good topic for this podcast, right? It's that people are looking for it, and that they're hungry for this information, and there's more and more representation, if the resources and the links and things that you're trying to pass out are more readily available. And there's just so much more, documentaries, disclosure, we exist. There's so many things out there now that are really going to give you this lived experience. And I love how we're talking about whether you're an introvert or you're an extrovert or you're this or you're that, and what you can do. Because oftentimes we're just say, don't do this and don't do that and don't do this. And it's like, that fear of stepping outside of yourself is really, and I'll say, honestly, I don't know. Jeff talks all the time about how my friendship impacted him. I mean, Jeff has opened my world to an idea that, like, and I say this with a lot of love, that not all Christians are scary. I mean, I will say that I grew up in a way in which that it wasn't comfortable or safe. And so Jeff had to put himself at a certain vulnerability to deal with my skepticism, right? And so that was work. And so it was work that was, I'm happy he feels so well worth it. But it was, because you have to see where people are in order to meet them where they are. So I'll have to give a shout out to Jeff for that.
We'll end on this little love fest by saying that putting any small risk that I took was well worth it to know you. So, all right. On that note, I'm going to stop the recording, and we can keep chatting, but we'll end here.
Now, this was such a fascinating discussion, and I'm so thrilled to have been a part of it, honored that I was invited to be a part of it, and I've learned so much in the conversation, as well as listening back to the conversation, and then going to, and I'll share this resource on the on starkreflections.ca as a downloadable PDF, but it's the gender map that you can use for your characters. But I wanted to use it on myself because, as a white privileged, middle-aged, heterosexual male, one would assume that on the gender map I was going to be male, male, masculine, masculine, heterosexual, etc., and all the way like straight down. But when I look at the multiple dimensions, it's something like assigned sex, okay, male, and a gender identity, a man, and then gender expression presentation. Well, I do feel quite feminine in a lot of my expression and presentation. Now, I look like a badass man, but in many ways, I believe that my persona is very much. I used to joke. Was in touch with my anima. Anima was what the real word is, but just saying that in a joking fashion. But so my gender expression presentation, I put it right in the middle. More leaning quite heavily on the feminine side, even though I may not present that way. I feel like I express that way. especially because I'm a big softie in many ways. And then gender role as well. I put that in the middle between masculine and feminine because I do believe that the things that I value and like and appreciate are not necessarily the masculine things. Sports and the rugged man things, I tend to identify in a lot of ways with things that are more maybe societally considered feminine or female. And that's cool, and I love that about myself. Now, sexual orientation, I'm heterosexual, but attraction, I find both men and women attractive, and I can appreciate a good-looking man just like I can appreciate a good-looking woman. And that's always been something. I like looking at good-looking people, regardless of male or female. So in terms of attraction, yeah, I can definitely see why, why women find certain men hot, or why men find certain men hot. And so I'm proud of the fact that I can find both men and women attractive, or unattractive for that matter. And then of course my legal sex is male, so it's not a straight line all the way down one side of the chart. And I think an important thing, just understanding that about myself, understands the nuances of a character, and doing something like that for a character that you're writing can really help flesh them out. So when I go back to Michael Andrews, my Canadian werewolf in New York character, who drops onto his knees and starts bawling and apologizing to Gail when he finds out that she's engaged to another man, that is part of who he is, because I guess that's exactly what I would do in that situation. So it seemed realistic to me. But what I didn't do is I didn't map out his gender, and then I didn't ensure that in the previous scenes in that story that I revealed that or showed that rather than tell, right? Show, don't tell. But in any case, the gender map's there on starkreflections.ca. This was a phenomenal conversation. Longest episode of my podcast ever. I was going to break it into 2 episodes, but I just wanted you to have it all at once, because we took a 7-minute break or whatever in the middle, and I was just so eager. I just needed to go to the washroom. I needed to get more coffee, but I was so eager to get back into the conversation. I didn't want to leave you hanging, for another week or whatever. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Stark Reflections podcast. I hope you found the same amazing value that I got out of it. If you like the podcast and would like to support the podcast, you can check us out over at patreon.com/starkreflections, where as for as little as $1, $3, or $5 a month, you can get access to additional bonus content. Or you can also leave a review on the podcatcher of your choice, or better yet, share this podcast with someone that you think would find value in it. Again, thank you so much for listening to this podcast. This is Mark Leslie Lefebvre. Until next week. So until a few days from now, when the next episode comes out. So until episode 173, this is Mark wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.